I'm going to go talk about the scale-related security issues. There we go. And why is that doing that? Whatever. Back. Okay, much better. So yeah, so scale-related security issues. You'll notice I said scale, not scalability, because we're not really talking about scalability here. We're just talking about, I go change the number, what are the implications, and what kind of attacks can be made easier or harder by changing that block size number. And I kind of want to go start out with really like, what are we trying to actually accomplish? What is the system meant to be? And I kind of thought about it a bit, and of course, nobody really agrees on what it's meant to be. But what's interesting about it is, as much as we disagree about what it's meant to be, there really are some sort of key things which all the different visions of what Bitcoin could be do go share. And chief among them is validation. So you can go ask the question, well, what are we trying to prevent? Well, we're trying to prevent an invalid transaction. I'm trying to prevent getting money that doesn't actually exist. So in this case, suppose I'm someone with transaction TX1. And from an SPV wallet's point of view, this is kind of the data I see. All I know is that I can link it to some blockchain, it's in there, but what I don't know is that transaction valid? I'm currently in this state still trusting someone. And in Bitcoin, we have the ability of determining if things are valid by just going back in history and validating each step. Here, transaction 0 was spent in transaction 1 and so on. And I can go back and go through all these different cases. And that does not work. There. Obviously, if something's gone wrong, we have an invalid transaction. We'll notice this if we do this validation, go back in history. Similarly, the transaction might not exist at some point. And then finally, money might be spent twice. That pretty much covers, funny enough, all these different use cases that all these different people want in terms of, are the rules being followed? And when you talk about attacks, one of the issues I kind of had with this talk was I was thinking, all right, what are the attacks possible? And actually, it's pretty boring. It's someone puts invalid data. I want to know if that data in the blockchain is invalid. Because if I don't, well, the system just plain doesn't work. And the whole attack and the whole scale-related thing as well, how much data do I need to determine if someone's doing something invalid? And right there, if I'm going to go through transaction history, immediately, in the case of Bitcoin, due to a lot of optimization issues, due to a lot of things that could potentially be done but haven't, long story short is I need the whole transaction history. Can we go and improve on that? Well, in some ways, yes, and I'll give a quick example. I like to use Where's Waldo here, where imagine if the problem of finding that two transactions spent the same money was kind of akin to playing Where's Waldo. And we want to go find, did two Waldos exist? And it's very easy to go prove this. We showed everyone else, hey, you have two Waldos in one place. Here's where they are. Going back to my previous slide, again, TX1A exists, TX1B exists, they spend the same money. And that's our proof, very easy. You don't need very much data to show this. And in a system where information is easy to propagate and tough to censor, I can go and just spread this proof to the rest of the world. And it becomes a very easy question of, all right, is the blockchain invalid? Hey, someone found an invalid part of it. Attacks thwarted, done. Of course, from the miner's perspective, again, one of these issues of how does Bitcoin actually work right now, it's a lot of effort to go through and find that invalid Waldo in the first place, the double spend. And it's not, there's a lot of techniques in the future to go consider, but from the point of view of right now scaling, this is one of our big issues. How do we manage this problem that currently we have this O(n)² validation, and anyone who wants to be a miner and actually has to create valid blocks has to do all this work and have access to all this data. Another big scaling related thing. Let's go look at what does it take for someone external to the system to attack it. And what this here is a very convenient example for me, which is Bitcoin XT blocks. Which blocks have been produced in the blockchain that advertise that they supported BIP 101. And you'll notice how it kind of goes up and then goes down again. That's because of an external attack. Someone went off and DDoSed a bunch of mining pools. Well, actually, I think mainly Slush is really it. And they essentially threatened them, saying, if you continue supporting BIP 101, we're going to keep DDoSing you till you give up. And reality is they gave up. And what does that have to do with scale? Well, again, if you're in an environment where the way we participate in Bitcoin is through relatively centralized targets, like Slush Mining Pool, it's fairly easy to go pick and choose these targets and attack them till they give up. And to the extent that the question of scale changes, what these trade-offs are, that's another scale-related security concern. And personally, I think that the fact that we have this issue at 1 megabyte is definitely cause for concern. We should think very carefully about this. And now when I went and talked about, what do we want out of Bitcoin? Well, I think this is sort of where the talk starts to get a little more interesting and potentially a little more controversial. Because then you start to ask, well, what do we actually want from Bitcoin? And it's not clear to me that this is something we have good answers for, but, in a centralized or distributed system, the main thing that's in common with most systems we deal with is that there are single points of failure. Paige Peterson, who's in the audience somewhere here, made this nice diagram showing how in a centralized system or a distributed system, ultimately you have these points of control, and you can target these points of control by pursuing them legally, technically, or so on. And currently in Bitcoin, we kind of look a little like this. We haven't done a great job on miner centralization. So if your goal is to go and decrease the number of single points of failure, that's really what you should be talking about as a security concern. And what's interesting there is that now we have this issue where in Bitcoin, anything that can lead to monopoly, anything that can lead to incentives to further centralize, that can be seen as a security consideration. That's something that causes issues with the inherent goal of the system. So here's probably the biggest topic in this. Do large miners have an advantage over small miners? And here I'll go show China versus the US in sort of a simplified model and talk a little bit about how this kind of comes into play. Now, the question is, all right, who's going to find the next block? China has a little more hashing power than the US, so chances are block number 3 is going to be found by China. Now imagine it is. Well, we have an issue, the Great Firewall of China. And what's interesting is for a brief amount of time, depending on the block size and how long it takes for data to propagate around the network, at this moment, the US mining pools don't know that block 3 exists. From their point of view, block 2 is the most recent valid block. So they're still working on block 2, trying to go extend the chain. And they might go find a block extending the chain. But when they go find that block extending the chain, again, Great Firewall of China exists. Now we have this fork, and how is that fork going to get resolved? Well, what's the probability of who finding what block, considering what they know? China still doesn't know about block 3B. And even if they did, the way the incentives work is you might as well mine on the block you went and found first, because that's the one that's most likely to propagate to the widest number. And then they go find block 4. Maybe at this point the US knows about this, maybe they don't. The point is, by the time it resolves, that's your most probable outcome. That block 3A was incorporated in the blockchain, block 4 was built on top of it, block 3B wasn't. So I went through all that. Now let's go ask ourselves what really happened here. Well, in terms of monopoly, what we really said is that the US had a disadvantage there, where they went and did a lot of work, and they didn't get rewarded for it. And in a nutshell, I think that's probably one of your more interesting questions on scalability. Do we have a system where there are incentives for people to get bigger, and for the larger pools, once they're bigger, what kind of profitability do they then have? And I can go talk a bit about this where, let's go look at what research is being done. First of all, we have the sort of pre-selfish mining paperwork. We have people who've gone shown with some math that, depending on how you go assume blocks are propagated. If I find a block and I get it's 50% of the hashing power, right there, who's going to find the next block? Chances are I'm going to find the block, and the other 49% are less likely to find that block. So when you go talk about this, what this means is once I'm at that threshold, now I have the advantage. Bit more work followed up, and we were able to kind of say, all right, depending on how you propagate information around, this threshold's about 30%. That was again shown in the selfish mining paper in different ways. And on top of that, now we've done various simulation results. Big one that works out really well is Peter Wool's work, where we've gone and shown that, and he actually used realistic mining and latency numbers with this, where when you look at the situation in China, for the amount of time it takes data to propagate over the Great Firewall of China and their kind of relative hashing power percentage, people who are not part of that group are earning something like about 8% less revenue. In reality, that doesn't really happen that way because of, for instance, Matt Corallo's block relay network. You have a lot of miners who aren't actually validating. They just mine based on the assumption the previous block was valid. So we've kind of pushed that number down. But we've got to talk about the worst case in security. And in the worst case, we're in a situation where, under these kind of assumptions, there's a fairly significant revenue difference between large miners and small miners. And ultimately, I think this being an overview, I'll kind of say, well, let's go look at that. Let's go and say where we can go and go from there. Let's do our assumptions based on that kind of worst case. So I was actually kind of planning on leaving a bit of time for questions, so this bit shorter than I was expecting, but I'm happy to stop here. So
thank you, Peter, Todd. Thank you.